Hello friends and potential friends. Well, I'm back in the kitchen again. Seems my freezer's getting full, so it's time to do some canning. If you see my outdoor updates, you know I've been growing a lot of collards and mustard greens and a few other things as well. But I planted too much this year, and so I'm only halfway through the picking season, and I'm going to have to do some canning to free up some space in the freezer. Generally what I do whenever I pick a batch of collards or mustard or any greens like that, I bring them inside, clean them up good, cut the stems out of them, and stuff them into freezer bags and put them in the freezer. Well, freezer got full, so it's time to get them in jars so I can, because I'll be picking some more before too long. Over here I've got some jars in my water bath canner heating up. I've been scrubbing jars all morning, but I want to make sure that I have those good and hot when I start putting hot collards into them. The stock pot you see next to them is where I'll be wilting down the collards. We'll probably chop up an onion, maybe a few cloves of garlic, put in with them, and I'll probably add a strip of bacon and a little bit of salt, maybe a quarter of a teaspoon of salt to each pint jar. And then I'll put them into the pressure canner for 75 minutes. You probably know the drill, but that's what we're doing today. So let me go ahead and get some of these collards into the stock pot. I'm actually going to, let me go back around to these guys. It's actually going to be a combination of things this year. I've got 3 big bags stuffed full of collard greens. Looks like 3 big bags stuffed full of mustard greens. Well, that one's not that full. Also have a couple of bags of kale and a bag of Swiss chard. That'll add a little bit of color to the mix. And while I was digging in the freezer, I also found a couple of bags of radishes that I stored away a couple years ago, so I'll be putting some radish greens in here as well. Ought to make a good combination. Okay, I managed to stuff about half the greens into my stock pot, and it's right up to the top. It's a mix of mustard, collards, and radishes, and I think I put a bag of the kale in there as well. Didn't put the Swiss chard in there, but I did put everything else back in the freezer because I only used up about half of those bags I had laid out here. And incidentally, while that's starting to cook down, I'm trying something new too. Yesterday I was out picking kale. No, not kale. Yesterday I was out picking Swiss chard, and I noticed that the stems of the Swiss chard smelled an awful lot like celery. So I decided to cut up the stems, put them in freezer bags or in vacuum sealed bags just like I do with celery, and I'm going to add those to soups and things just like I do with celery. See how that turns out. Does add a nice color to it, don't you think? And I did taste a couple of them, and they taste fairly close to celery as well, so that ought to work out pretty good. Now it's just a matter of wilting down the greens. Some people like to steam their greens. Some like to just put them in a pot and boil them. I'm doing basically a combination of both. I added a quart of chicken stock and a quart of water to that pan. Only brought it up about 1/3 of the way, but that'll put enough liquid in there to wilt down the greens and might add a little bit of flavor as well. And really the sole purpose of this is to wilt them down so that I can stuff more of the greens into the jars. Because before you wilt them, they take up an awful lot of space. So I'll bring you back when those are wilted down, and we'll see how much of a difference it makes. Okay, the greens have cooked down to about half their previous volume. Now keep in mind, when you're cooking the greens like this, you're not really looking to cook them. You just want to wilt them so that you can stuff more of the greens into each jar. they'll be fully cooked by the time they come out of the pressure canner. So the next step is to start putting them in jars. I'm going to have to do a little bit of rearranging here, so I'll bring you back when I'm ready for that step. Okay, rearranging is done. I've got the pressure canner on the stove. I lifted the jars out of the hot water and I moved the stock pot over here where I can work with it. So let's go ahead and start filling up jars. One hot jar. Now, I don't want a lot of the juice, so I'm going to use this strainer to strain it out. Let's see what I can do without making too big of a mess. Okay, now I'm going to make a mess. What can I say? Use my stuffer. Looks like the radish stems are a little bit long, but that's okay. A bit more here. And basically you're looking for about 1 inch of headspace. Which that's a little bit over an inch. Or a little bit under. Plus I forgot one of the most important ingredients. Into each of these jars I'm going to put about 1/4 of a teaspoon of canning salt and secret ingredient, slice of bacon. Now we'll take my towel moistened with vinegar. Around the rim carefully. Oh, I'm going to have to add a little bit of water to that too. And I want to make sure I got all the bubbles out, which I'm pretty sure I did when I was packing it in there. A little bit more juice. And let's go around the rim one more time. Making sure that it's nice and clean and that there are no chips or cracks. Take our little magnet and grab a lid, or I guess they call these ones flats. Put that on there. Put it on just finger tight. And into the pressure canner. You know the drill on that one. Let me go ahead and get the rest of these done, and then I'll probably have to put another set of jars in the water to heat up, because my pressure canner will hold 16 pints and I've only got 8, maybe 9 heated up right now. So I'll bring you back in a little bit. Okay, there we have it. 16 pint jars of mixed greens in the pressure canner. I'm going to put a little bit of this vinegar in the water to keep the jars from clouding up during the process. Turned out those 16 jars were just the right amount for the greens that I had wilted down. Although I only did half of what was in the freezer, I guess I'm going to be doing another batch before too long. But I put some oil on the seal for the pressure canner. Put the lid on tight. Oh, and incidentally, because I did 2 layers of jars in there, I did put a metal spacer between each layer. That way the jars aren't touching each other too badly. We put the lid on it and then crank up the heat. Next step will be the venting process. And then once the canner comes up to pressure, we'll be pressure canning these greens for 75 minutes. Now, the ball book says the greens go for 70 minutes, but because I put that bacon in there, bacon calls for 75, so I'll be doing the 75 minutes. And I'll bring you back when something more exciting happens. Okay, starting to get some good venting going on. Hopefully you can see that there. So I'm going to start the timer for 10 minutes. Let that vent. Make sure that vent is nice and clear. And at the end of the 10 minutes, I'll put the jiggler on there and bring it up to pressure. Got a good head of steam going now. And there's the 10-minute timer. Always use some kind of mitt or glove to put these things on. You don't want that steam getting to you. And notice the little pressure indicator is already popped up. So for my altitude, I have to get this up to over 10 pounds of pressure. I think I'm about 25 feet above sea level or something like that. And once it gets up to pressure, I'll have to turn down the stove a little bit. My jiggler doesn't really jiggle, at least not too much. So I have to watch the pressure gauge to make sure it doesn't fluctuate too much. And I do that using the dial on the stove. Once I get it tuned in, it usually stays pretty steady until near the end of the process. But I'll bring you back in a little bit and we'll see what's going on. Okay, there we are at 10 pounds of pressure. I will set the timer for 75 minutes and I will turn down the stove a little bit in order to stabilize it at between 10 and 11 pounds. Now, call me paranoid, that's okay. But when I'm doing pressure canning, I don't leave the kitchen. I don't want to leave this thing unattended at all. So I'll be sitting here watching this gauge for the next 75 minutes. Playing with the stove a little bit as I need to. And y'all don't need to hang out for that. It's really boring. So I'll bring you back next time something happens. Okay, that's 75 minutes. Next step, just turn off the stove and carefully move the canner off of the hot burner. And now we just let it sit there and slowly release its pressure. That'll take somewhere between 1 and 2 hours. And I will see you in a bit. Well, it's been a little bit over an hour. Pressure has dropped to 0. The little pressure pop-up is all the way down. So it should be safe to open this thing. Yep, no pressure. And note to self, always lift this lid away from you. There's still a lot of steam in there. And you don't want it coming up in your face. And let's see what we got in here. Yeah, it looks pretty good. Might have been able to stuff it just a little bit deeper, but that looks pretty good. Let me get these things out of here and then I'll show you the results. There we are, 16 pints of yum. Some of them I could have gotten a little bit more greens into them, but I'm going to be happy with that. Not to mention I've probably got enough still in the freezer to do another 16 pints. not to mention what's still growing outside. So I'm still working at clearing up freezer space. Well, that's the whole process for canning greens. Any kind of greens you want. You saw I did collards, mustard, kale, Swiss chard, radishes. You can also do cabbage, turnip greens, pretty much any leafy vegetable. And as you can see, I'm gonna have to do a lot more canning here before too long, because all of my collards are still growing. The cats are still growing. That's Licorice. He's my gardening buddy. Kale's still growing good. Swiss chard growing good. So I'll be doing some more canning before too long. Meanwhile, I'll see you the next time.